And welcome once again to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. Joining me as he always does, Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, great to see you.
So, very big news with this prisoner exchange. Bowe Bergdahl comes home. He's not quite home yet, but in the process. And in exchange, the Obama administration sends back 5 Taliban commanders. What drove this?
Well, I think you had the administration wanting, obviously, to see an American soldier returned. And I think first and foremost, getting him back was a principal goal. But I think also what you have is the administration right on the heels of having announced the Afghan drawdown policy for the next 2 years, wanting very much to close the narrative of the war in Afghanistan. This is an administration that has defined its foreign policy, if you will, its Obama doctrine, really being about the ending of wars, the tides of war receding. And so I think part of what was motivating this deal and what was giving it so much energy and life here at the tail end was to draw closure to the policy itself and to say, we are exiting Afghanistan and we're getting our last remaining soldier who's in custody back home. And I think that was part of what was animating. There's a factor here too, Bob, the fact that we're not going to have troops on the ground long term, the fact that our intelligence footprint would diminish over time affects also the tactics here, because over time we'd have less of an ability to find him, be able to get him back, and our leverage would be less. And so this was a moment the administration saw to get our guy back and to begin the closure of our presence in Afghanistan.
Well, now let me ask you this. You were not in on these negotiations, but you've been in the White House in this similar kind of situation. How does that discussion take place? I mean, doesn't the subject come up? What about the blowback? What about the idea of the appearance that we're negotiating with terrorists? We never do that. How does that conversation happen?
Well, it happens over time, and these conversations happened and started back in 2011. And so he was taken early in 2009, and so the questions of how are you going to return him sort of are foremost. But no doubt they should have been thinking about the consequences, costs, and risks of the decision that they were making. That has to be part of the calculus. Now, these are hard decisions. The question is, what do you do to get an American serviceman who's in enemy custody back? Any president would want to see that happen. The question is, how do you deal with the costs and consequences, and is the price too high?
Well, let's talk about that. Is the price too high? What's your opinion here? These are bad guys that we returned, and there's a good chance they go back to the battlefield.
I think it's a really tough call, but I think you do what you can to get your soldier back. You get your citizens back. I think the distinction between a soldier and citizen here is also perhaps a false distinction, because we've got lots of American citizens who get taken custody by foreign terrorist groups and such. So it's a tough call. The problem I have with it fundamentally is we did negotiate with terrorists. And we have a fundamental policy that we adhere to. And we've adhered to that to the detriment of our citizens over time, where we've seen, for example, when I was in the White House, American hostages at hostage farms in Iraq, where other citizens of different countries, French, Italian, other European countries, being freed because those governments were willing to pay the hostage takers, while our citizens were kept in custody for longer periods of time because we were not willing to deal. We were not willing to pay. And so I think there's fundamental damage here. Put aside the risk of these 5 returning to the fight, providing political capital, and the long-term future of Afghanistan, which are all important considerations. There is a long-term question of, have we done damage to the notion that the American government does not do deals with terrorist groups?
And then back to where we started. So if the Obama administration policy is ending wars, the receding of wars, how does this help their narrative if part of that discussion has to be, yeah, but to do that, they negotiated with terrorists and they put perhaps other Americans at risk?
Well, I think in some ways it's myopic in a sense, because the war is not ending simply because we withdraw. It's the debate we've had and the discussion we've had about having this narrative and this policy while the rest of the world is burning. Right? The fight is not ending in Afghanistan. And from an Afghan perspective, this is a horrible deal, because you've given the enemy some of its chief elements. Some of the founders of the Taliban itself are now potentially back in the fight. They're going to raise money. They're going to propagandize. They're going to rejoin the fight. In addition, they are chips in the negotiation for the Afghan government itself. And so we've just given away some of the prized commodities in a reconciliation deal, for example, between the Afghan government and the Taliban. So your question is a good one, Bob, because we have in some ways thought of this from a very American perspective. But the reality is this is an ongoing fight. These are ongoing committed fighters and leaders of this movement. And this is going to be a threat to the Afghans. It's going to be a threat to our citizens and our soldiers who are going to remain in theater for some time to come.
And we have to leave it there, but the administration will own the fallout, whatever that is.
It's only going to get worse. And the one thing I would say, Bob, as criticism is, should not have elevated this issue. There should not have been a Rose Garden ceremony. When President Bush and the U.S. government helped the recovery of 3 American citizens who'd been in the jungles of Colombia, held by the FARC for 5 years, that was a mission, a fantastic mission by the Colombian government that we assisted. Not once did you see or hear from the president on that. The 3 came into the Oval Office quietly, but not publicly. The reason was you never want to elevate the value of hostage taking for the hostage takers. And that's what the president did with the Rose Garden ceremony. And I think that's part of the problem. It's not the what here, it's the how. The way they executed this and talked about it has now become a disaster for them.
We've got to leave it there. Juan, very controversial, but thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.